The United States engaged in a vicious guerrilla war against Vietnam for 12 long years. Vietnam won in the end despite the United States' wealth and military superiority because of its determination to reunite the country, end foreign control, and maintain national pride. The Vietnamese People's War of Resistance was not the first of its kind, nor would it be the last. You have most likely seen Mulan, a Disney animated film. Perhaps you were inspired by the tale of a Chinese girl who posed as a boy to prevent her ailing father from signing up with the Chinese Imperial Army. Her efforts resulted in averting disaster in China, and she is now revered there as a hero. As a matter of fact, Mulan isn't the first woman of Vietnamese descent to receive widespread acclaim. The Trung sisters came before her. For 3 years, during the initial Chinese occupation of Vietnam, these Vietnamese women led the military and orchestrated a number of uprisings. Decades after their heroic deeds, they are still revered as heroes today. When all hope seemed lost, they came to Vietnam's aid. Vietnam's northern neighbor and potential superpower, China, would soon overshadow its early years. By the late 3rd century BCE, the kingdom of Olac had successfully repelled an invasion by troops dispatched from the Chinese Qin dynasty. However, the Chinese general Chiuda overthrew Olac and consolidated his power in the region in 180 BCE. His Nam Viet kingdom remained autonomous for a century until the Chinese Han Emperor Wu Ti toppled it in 111 BCE. Wu Ti. Vietnamese people spent the next 1,000 years fighting to maintain their nation's integrity, reclaim their independence, and keep their culture alive while under Chinese rule. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Hallmark's Historic Channel. Once upon a time in a land not too far away, there were 2 sisters who became famous and won the hearts of a whole country. The 2 women who dared to go where no one had gone before were the Trung sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi. They fought for the freedom of their people despite facing tremendous personal risk. Forever memorialized in history as an example of the strength of sisterhood and the human spirit, their story never ceases to inspire new generations. Follow along as we revisit the legend of the Trung sisters and learn more about their triumphs, tribulations, and enduring legacy. During this time, the Han government actively promoted political, cultural, and social assimilation. They instituted new forms of taxation and appointed Chinese tribal heads as rulers. Women were given the right to inherit property and had legal rights within the family, both of which had been denied them under Chinese rule. The introduction of Confucianism by the Chinese resulted in the subordination of Vietnamese women to their husbands. Men also gained the right to marry multiple wives in the event that the first one failed to produce a son. Women were barred from taking civil service exams and were thus prevented from entering the bureaucracy. As the Chinese administrators raised taxes and attempted to tighten their grip on the lac lords, resentment of Chinese rule grew. The term lac lords refers to the indigenous Vietnamese landed aristocracy. The Trung sisters lived in the My Lang village and were the daughters of the lac lord chief. The sisters were raised with a spirit of patriotism and love of military art by their mother, Ba Man Tien, who was said to be a descendant of the Han kings. They learned to be resilient and self-reliant. An elder sister named Trung Trac is credited with killing a white tiger that had a reputation for invincibility in the area. People all over the country were impressed by this brave deed. Thi Soc, son of a lac lord in the neighboring Chu Dien fortress, became Trung Trac's husband. They tied the knot but remained geographically apart. The provinces of Vinh Phu, Ha Bach, and Ha Tay preserve relics from this era. After witnessing the Chinese governor's brutality firsthand, both Trung Trac and her husband became infuriated. Su Ting, the Chinese governor, had Thi Soc executed after he opposed tax increases and efforts to culturally assimilate the Vietnamese. The Chinese government believed this move would prevent further challenges to their authority, but instead, it encouraged even more people to speak out against them. Trung Trac was motivated to fight for her country after witnessing the murder of her husband. She put her grief aside and, ahead of the funeral services, took off her black mourning cloak and turban. It was she and her sister Trung Nhi who raised the banner of rebellion and rallied the other nobility and peasants. Trung Trac put on her golden armor decorated with a carving of a My Lang bird and fastened a belt around her waist that featured a buckle adorned with small bells. According to urban legend, Her appearance so stunned the Chinese troops that they had to retreat. Women generals from the cities of Bataan, Nguyat-Tien, Nguyat-Du, and Lachan in the lowlands stood on either side of the sisters. Feng Tichin, the pregnant wife of a noble, was one of the commanders. Legend has it that she gave birth in the heat of battle and kept fighting while carrying her newborn on her back. Su Ting was forced to abandon his home after the Trung sisters launched an attack. The Vietnamese enjoy telling the story of how Su Ting had to shave his beard and hair and leave the country covertly via sewage pipe. The Chinese were finally defeated by the Trung armies in the year 40 CE. Within their new My Linh capital, the sisters crowned themselves as rulers of Nam Viet. As part of their brief rule, they freed prisoners and soldiers who had been conscripted into the Chinese army, and they also distributed Su Ting's wealth to the poor. However, the freedom was only temporary. The Chinese emperor issued plans for a retake of the territory 2 years later. Veteran General Ma Yuan was dispatched to put down the rebellion. Until they encountered the Trung armies southwest of My Linh, his troops faced little resistance. Ultimately, however, Ma Yuan's forces triumphed, and the Trung sisters were put to flight. Legend has it that the two sisters committed suicide by drowning in the river Hat Giang at Cam Kay, north of the Red River, on the border between the provinces of Vinh Phu and Ha Tây, rather than submit to Chinese rule after they were defeated. However, there are reports that the sisters were captured by the invading Chinese and executed. Regardless of what happened to the Trung sisters, their legacy will always be remembered by the Vietnamese people. The Vietnamese honored their female warriors in the record of Queen Trung. After the Trung sisters were vanquished, Chinese oppression of the Vietnamese only grew worse. There were a few minor revolts before 248 CE, when 19-year-old Ba Chiu, a noble woman, led a major uprising. The mythical deeds of the Trung sisters and Ba Chiu attest to the respect and honor women in Vietnam are afforded in everyday life. Historically, Vietnamese women have had much more freedom and respect than women in other parts of the world, especially in Asia. The Vietnamese people have a lot of respect for the Trung sisters. Their story has been memorialized in songs, poems, plays, stamps, posters, and even monuments. The two sisters are commemorated by a pagoda in Hat Mon and the Two Sisters Pagoda in Hai Ba, both of which are located in Hanoi. An avenue in the middle of Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, and several schools are named after the two sisters. All the memorials and works of literature written about the sisters celebrate the many successful missions they led. A memorial for the sisters, who died in 43 AD, is held annually on the first Sunday of February. All Vietnamese know that the sisters led the first major revolt against the Chinese, who had ruled the country for 247 years. 2,000 years after the uprisings of the Trung sisters against the Chinese, their influence is still felt in Vietnam. The sisters stand for freedom in Vietnam and are the country's symbol. In paintings, the women ride gigantic war elephants as they lead their followers into battle. Thus, the Trung Trac sisters will always be remembered as role models of strength, perseverance, and sisterhood. Their experience exemplifies the strength and change that women can bring to the world. We hope you liked this quick glance into the life of these extraordinary fighters. Those who desire to learn more about other extraordinary people throughout history could perhaps subscribe to the Hallmark History Channel and like this video. Thank you for being so open to joining us on this journey.